Don't call anyone.
You chose the wrong station.
No, I chose the only medic still alive.
You're the enemy.
Tonight, I'm only your patient.
Who did this to you?
They found me.
Then stay quiet and let me work.
Why are you helping me?
Because I'm a medic before I'm a soldier.
Kale Voss had been awake for 29 hours when he heard the sound at the door. He knew the number because he'd started counting when the ceasefire came in, a habit he'd developed sometime in the second year of the Kolith campaign and hadn't managed to shake since. It gave the part of his brain that couldn't be useful something to do, the part that wanted to spiral out toward the casualty numbers, the ones who hadn't made it, the specific arithmetic of a bad engagement. He kept count instead. It was boring enough to be grounding. The field station wasn't much. A reinforced alcove carved into the lower level of a bombed-out relay tower, its walls still holding despite what the eastern ridge had thrown at the surrounding terrain over the past 72 hours. Someone had bricked over the worst of the gaps before Voss inherited the space. The roof leaked when it rained, but there hadn't been rain in 11 days. And the 2 folding cots, the portable lamp, and the supply cases stacked along the north wall made it functional enough. It smelled the way all field stations smelled. Antiseptic, old blood, dust he'd stopped noticing months ago. The patient in the corner, a Virith infantry corporal named Reth, 3rd Division. Not his unit was breathing evenly now. That hadn't been the case 3 hours ago. Someone had dressed a chest wound in the field with the wrong technique. Good pressure, but the wrong placement. And by the time Reth arrived at the relay station, he'd been working against his own sealed injury. It took Voss an hour and 40 minutes to undo what the original medic had done and redo it correctly. The corporal's color had only stabilized in the last half-hour silver pale in the usual Virith way, but with the right undertone now, not the wrong one. Voss was cleaning his instruments when the sound happened, not a knock. There was no door to knock on, just a sheet of bent panel propped at an angle against the opening, letting air circulate while keeping out most of the wind. It shifted now, scraped slightly against the floor, and went still. A small sound, the sound of someone who had arrived somewhere and then stopped. Deciding, he set down the instrument he was holding and waited. The panel moved again, wider this time. She had to duck slightly to clear the frame. He'd seen Virith officers before the Coalition attached them to most of the ground commands at this posting. Senior personnel moving through the forward camps, but he'd never had one step into his station at this hour. She was tall and silver-skinned, with the characteristic Virith build that the Coalition field manual described as engineered rather than grown. A phrase he'd thought was strange when he first read it and had since decided was fairly accurate. Her rank insignia were 3 angled bars enclosed in a circle. He'd learned the Virith command markings because not knowing had caused problems once, and he'd decided it wouldn't cause problems again. Commander. She was holding her left arm against her body, not the casual kind of holding. The way someone might cross their arms against the cold, the deliberate kind. The kind that meant someone had made a decision about how to manage something and was executing that decision with full awareness of the cost. He didn't stand up. His legs were past the point where standing would have been anything other than a performance, and he didn't think a performance was what either of them needed. He kept his hands in his lap, visible and still, and said, "Commander," in the same tone he used for anyone who came through that panel, the tone of someone awake and present and not alarmed. She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes moved across the space the way the eyes of people in difficult situations often did, cataloging, assessing, looking for whatever information would tell them whether this was safe. The lamp, the cases, the sleeping figure of Corporal Reth in the corner. Her eyes were pale silver with darker silver rings, and they caught the light in a way that made them look colder than they probably were. "You are the human who provides medical assistance," she said. "Some of it, yes." He kept his voice even. "The surgeon is about 2 kilometers east. I can send a runner if no." The word was flat and immediate. He looked at her arm again, at the way the fabric of her jacket Virith officer class, deep gray blue, designed to absorb a lot before showing anything had darkened along the left side. He looked at the very slight set of her jaw, the way she was managing her breathing. "All right," he said. "Come in then." She didn't move right away. He had the sense that come in wasn't what she'd been expecting, and the gap between expectation and reality had stopped her. He turned back to his tray and picked up the sterile drape and spread it across the empty case to his left, then began laying out what he'd probably need, in the order he'd need it. He didn't look up. The work of preparing a space for a patient was a language most people could read without being told. He heard the panel move again. 4 steps across the station and she came into the full range of the lamp. The wound was along her left rib cage, running up toward the shoulder. Edge damage blade or fast shrapnel. He couldn't tell yet. The jacket had compressed against it, which was both the reason she was still upright and not ideal for what was happening underneath the fabric. The blood had dried to a stain larger than it would look at first glance. She'd been managing this for a while. He did the math and kept it off his face. "Sit," he said, nodding toward the case. She looked at the case. She looked at him. "I am a commander of the 4th Virith Strike, I know." He said it without quite interrupting her, more like catching the sentence before it needed to finish. "You can still sit down." A pause. Then she sat. He moved to her left side and reached for the fastenings of her jacket, and then stopped and looked up at her face before touching anything. "I need to open this to see what I'm working with. Is that all right with you?" It wasn't protocol. Nothing he'd been formally taught required asking. But it had always seemed obvious to him that the act of touching someone's body required their active consent, especially when that person had already chosen something that clearly hadn't been easy to choose. He waited. She looked at him for a moment. Then, yes, he worked the fastenings. Virith uniform closures were pressure-sensitive nodes rather than anything mechanical, and he figured out the sequence by watching which part of her good arm had been reaching before she'd shifted position coming through the door. First node. Second node. Third, the jacket panel opened along the left seam, and he got his first clear look. It was bad enough that her being upright was a genuine achievement. "How long ago?" he asked, pulling the lamp closer and reaching for gloves. "The Eastern engagement ended approximately 4 hours ago." He didn't say anything about 4 hours. He heard it, registered it, filed it. "All right, this needs proper cleaning and debridement. There's foreign material in the tissue, and I'll need to close it in layers. It's going to hurt." He looked up briefly. "Standard local analgesics, do you know if they affect your biology?" "They do not, so you'll feel all of it." "I am aware." He looked at her a moment more. She was looking at a fixed point on the far wall, jaw set, the posture of someone who had already decided what this experience was going to cost them and intended to hold to that decision regardless of what happened during it. He'd seen the same posture on human soldiers. He didn't argue with it. "You can make noise," he said, "if you need to. There's only Reth here, and he's sedated. I do not require permission." "I know. I'm just saying it won't matter if it happens." She didn't respond. He began. The cleaning took close to 15 minutes. She made no sound for the first 8, and he kept his movements steady and his narration occasional, not reassurance, just information. Which layer, which instrument, which stage of the process. She seemed to take in information the same way she'd taken in the room when she first arrived, fully, without deflecting any of it. On the 9th minute, when he reached a piece of embedded material that was going to require patience to extract correctly, her breath came out hard through her teeth, controlled, abbreviated. A sound that cost her something to let happen, and her right hand gripped the edge of the case. He heard the metal flex. "Almost," he said. "I did not ask for commentary." "Right." He kept working. He waited until they were through the worst of it before he spoke again. "Can I ask your name?" "Commander." A silence longer than the pauses she'd been giving him for medical questions. "Sareth," she said. "Sareth," he said it once to make sure he had it right. "It's not standard practice. I know. Addressing patients by name during treatment. I find it helps me, personally. Reminds me that I'm working on a person." Something shifted in her posture. Not dramatically, she was not. He was beginning to understand. Someone who moved in dramatic ways. But something changed in the quality of her stillness. The way a structure changes when you adjust the load on one of its supports. "Continue," she said. He continued. The debridement was slow, and the only way to do it right was to keep it slow. Virith tissue was denser than human tissue at the cellular level, roughly 40% more so, according to the field manual, which he'd read twice in his first month and referenced regularly since, and the foreign material had traveled along a slightly different vector than it would have in a human patient. He adjusted by feel more than instruction. He'd been doing this long enough to trust his hands when the instruction ran out. He narrated when he was about to do something more uncomfortable, not as a warning. Just information. She seemed to prefer it. Her grip on the case eased slightly every time he spoke. "Your unit held the northern approach," he said at one point, while his hands were occupied with something that needed patience more than speed. He'd heard the engagement from the station. The Virith lines had been unmistakable, a different pattern of fire, a different kind of sustained pressure, for 14 hours. she said. Her voice was controlled, but not without effort. The Coalition's projected holding time was 9. The line discipline was different from what I've seen from other units, more deliberate. We have worked this terrain type before. The unit adapted accordingly. He found the edge of the shrapnel and began the careful work of extraction. She was telling him the operational version of the story, he thought. The vocabulary that fit the version a commander could tell. He didn't push for another version. Her right hand tightened once on the case and released. There, he said. She exhaled, slow and even, and didn't say anything about it. He moved into the closing stage. 3 layers, because surface closure wasn't enough for the depth of the injury. And he'd learned that on someone else's wound 2 years ago and hadn't let himself forget it. The Vireth cellular structure would do more of the work than the equivalent tissue in a human patient if he let it, which meant less force and more patience. And patience he had. The corporal, she said eventually, glancing toward Reth's corner. Chest wound, sealed incorrectly in the field. He'll be fine. He kept his eyes on the work. 3rd Division, not your unit. I do not know him. I do. He was the first Vireth patient I treated when I got to this posting. He paused for a moment, not from the work but from what he was about to say. I didn't have the right calibration equipment for his biology. I managed, but it was approximate. I've been working around that gap ever since. He wasn't entirely sure why he told her that. He hadn't told anyone. But she was processing information the way certain engineers process tolerances, taking it in, filing it, finding a use for it later, and there was something about that quality of attention that made him less careful than usual about what came out of his mouth. When he finished the final layer and sealed it with the bioadhesive strip from his kit, he sat back and said, "You'll want a Vireth surgeon to look at this in 72 hours. I've done what I can with what I have. But the materials are human grade and your biology isn't. Get a proper review before the next engagement." Understood. She moved to stand. He raised his hand, not touching her, just raising it. 2 minutes. You lost a significant amount of blood over 4 hours. Let your system adjust before you make it carry you out of here. She looked at his raised hand, looked at him, sat back down. He reached behind the scanner on the case behind him and pulled out the ration pack he'd been saving since afternoon. Broke it in half. Held one half out without saying anything about it. "That is human food," she said. "It has glucose and protein. The field manual covers your metabolic compatibility with both." He didn't mention that he'd verified this specifically. That seemed like the kind of detail that would make the moment more complicated than it needed to be. "It'll do." She looked at the bar with the expression of someone running a calculation they've already decided the conclusion of, and then ate it in careful, even bites. He ate the other half and waited. The station was quiet around them. Reth's breathing was slow and steady in the corner. Outside, somewhere in the camp, a piece of equipment cycled through a low sound twice and went still. The lamp burned steadily between them. Voss had noticed, over the years, that silences in field stations came in specific types. The silence after incoming, the silence after surgery, the silence when someone was deciding something. This was the last kind. "Why did you not refuse?" she said. "When I came through the door. You were injured." He set down the last of his half of the bar. "That's the only reason that matters here." She looked at him then with a different quality of attention than she'd been giving him during treatment. Still evaluating, but slower, more considered. "Corporal K.L. Voss," she said, 3rd grade field medic, 5th year of coalition service. "You were formally recognized during the Kolith campaign's 7th month and declined the attached promotion. Didn't want the desk work. You are unusually competent for your rank." "I'm unusually competent for my rank because I stayed at my rank." He started reorganizing his tray. "Is there something else you needed tonight?" "Commander." Beyond the wound. The pause she gave him was different from the others, not consideration exactly. More like something that had been positioned one way being moved carefully to another. "No," she said. "You should stay another 10 minutes, he said. "I know you won't, but you should. Your blood pressure is probably lower than your baseline, and you came in on your own feet, and I'd prefer you leave the same way." She stood anyway. The movement was measured. The way soldiers moved when they were managing, more than they showed testing weight and balance before committing. She refastened the left panel of her jacket, and the wound disappeared under the dark fabric. And she was the commander again. Rank insignia level, bearing back in its place. At the door, she stopped. "The Kolith commendation," she said. "It noted that you treated 3 Vireth soldiers in addition to your assigned unit. They were hurt. They were not in your assignment. My assignment didn't get to them in time," he said. "So I did." Something moved across her face. Small, specific. and gone quickly enough that he might have missed it if he'd been less tired and less used to watching for things people didn't know they were showing. "I will consider returning for a follow-up," she said. "That's not the same as yes." "No," she agreed quietly. "It is not." And she went out. He sat in the lamplight for a while after. Reth's breathing was even. The camp outside was doing the particular quiet it did after ceasefires, not peaceful. Just exhausted. He thought about a person who had been losing blood for 4 hours without saying a word about it. Not from stubbornness, he thought. Or not only from that. From the kind of discipline that came from years of deciding in advance what things were permitted to cost. He cleaned the last instrument and set it in the tray and ate the cracker he'd saved since afternoon. He turned the lamp to low and did not sleep. She came back the next day. Not 2 days later, the way she'd implied. Not 3 days later, the way the wound's timeline would have suggested as the earliest realistic point of concern. The next day, late afternoon, when the light through the relay tower's upper gaps was still doing something warm on the south wall, and Voss was halfway through the inventory he'd been putting off for 4 days. He heard the panel before he turned. There was only one person at this posting who moved that way. No sound at all, and then, right at the last moment, the unavoidable scrape of the panel against the floor. "Sit down," he said, not turning, finishing the count on the adhesive strips first. "I did not say I was here for treatment. Your weight's off. I could hear it when you stepped through." He capped the stylus and turned around. "Sit down, Commander." A pause. She sat. The same case as the night before. The same straight posture. The left panel of her jacket was already half unfastened, not all the way, but enough that she'd clearly started doing it before she came through the door and hadn't wanted to admit that was why. "Infection?" he asked, crossing the station. "The tissue around the sealed area is warmer than the reference range suggests it should be." She said it the way she said most things, precise and without decoration. "I checked the Vireth field standard for wound temperature variance this morning. The reading falls within what would be classified as a concerning range." He crouched down and looked. Early-stage inflammatory response, the body doing exactly what bodies did when they encountered foreign material and weren't winning the argument quietly. Not infection yet, but the direction things were heading if he left it alone. "Did you sleep?" he asked, opening the kit. The relevant rest requirements were met. He looked up at her. "Yes," she said, which he was starting to understand was Sarath's version of fine. "Did you eat?" The metabolic requirements were,
"So no."
She said nothing, which he took as confirmation. He worked. He'd requisitioned the Vireth-compatible compound 2 weeks before the Eastern engagement, on the basis that the Coalition field manual listed it as effective for Vireth inflammatory response and that it cost nothing to have and potentially cost a great deal not to. He hadn't used it yet. He opened it now, applied it to the affected tissue carefully. And the texture of the work was different. This time her body knew what his hands were doing now, and the adjustment happened with less friction. "The compound I'm using now," he said, "is formulated for your cellular density. It should do better work than what I put on last night." A pause. "You already had this material?" "Yes, before I came in." "I like to be prepared." She was quiet for a moment. He was working close to the sealed wound, which meant the lamp was between them, which meant he could see her face without particularly trying to. The slight crease between her brows that appeared when she was processing something she hadn't anticipated. He'd noticed it last night, too. "The surgeons at Coalition Medical," she said eventually, "address Vireth officers with a significant amount of formal protocol. Rank acknowledgement at the start and end of each exchange. Species-specific honorifics." I know. He was trimming the edge of the original adhesive strip, replacing it with a clean seal. "I can do that if it's more comfortable for you." I didn't assume. I did not say it was more comfortable. He stopped, looked up at her. She was looking at the lamp, not at him. "I said they did it," she said. "I did not say I preferred it." He went back to work. After a moment, "Tell me what comfortable means to you then." He hadn't planned to ask it. The words had already left his mouth before the part of his brain that filtered things caught up, the way it sometimes did at the end of a long shift when the internal editor went quiet, and what came out was what he was actually thinking. She was quiet long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. "Information without social architecture," she said finally. "You provide information. You do not build around it, you do not arrange it, according to what you think I want to hear, or what protocols suggest you are obligated to say. That's accurate. The distinction," she said, slowly, "is significant. What you want to hear is your business," he said. "What I know is something I should give you accurately. Those are different things, and I don't see much value in blurring them." She considered this. He could feel her considering it, not in a way he could have pointed to specifically. More like the sense of a current in water, present without being visible. He finished the new seal and sat back. "Better," he said. "The compound will start addressing the inflammation within a few hours. You should feel a difference by morning." She didn't move to stand yet. He noticed and didn't say anything about it. In the 2 sessions he'd spent with her, he'd begun to understand that her stillness after the work was done wasn't reluctance or stalling. It was transition, the deliberate kind. The way she did everything. She was moving from one thing to the next at the pace she chose. "Standard of care," she said. "Does it change?" It wasn't quite a question. More like she was thinking out loud and had decided to let him hear it. "Does what change?" he said. "The standard of care you provide. Does it change based on rank?" "No." "Based on species?" "No." She looked at him then. Direct, not evaluating, or not only that. There was something else in it that he hadn't seen the first night. Virith medical officers will allocate significantly more time to higher-ranking patients, she said. The care received correlates to social standing. The practice is institutional. "I know," he said. "I've seen it. That's their system." "What is your system?" He thought about it. He'd been asked adjacent questions before. Why do you bother? Why does it matter, but not this one? Not exactly. Not the direct version. "You're bleeding," he said. "I fix that. That's the system." She looked at him for a long moment. The lamp was between them again, and in the light her eyes were pale silver with those darker rings. And they were not cold. He was beginning to suspect they were never cold. They simply did something different from what human eyes did with the lamplight. Caught it differently. Gave it back differently. And he'd been misreading that as temperature when it wasn't. "Virath High Command's standard assessment of human medical personnel," she said, "is that they are adequate for human casualties and should not be relied upon for allied biology. We were briefed to this effect when coalition integration began. That's a fair general assessment." He started reorganizing his tray. "I'm less general than most." "Yes," she said. "You are." She stood then, and this time he didn't stop her. The movement was steadier than the night before. She refastened the jacket panel and looked at him, and something in her expression shifted in a way that was harder to name. Not the small unlocking he'd seen last night, but something related to it, something that had found a little more room. 3 days, he said. "Come back if the temperature rises again before then, or if anything else changes. I will consider it." "That's the same thing you said last night." "Yes." Something at the edge of her expression acknowledged this without becoming a smile. "It is." "Sareth," he said. She stopped, already half-turned toward the door. There was a brief pause, automatic, like she'd been addressed by something she hadn't been expecting. "Commander," she corrected, the word coming out of a long habit. And then she stopped, actually stopped, mid-breath. The way people stopped when they heard themselves do something, and caught it a beat too late. He watched her register it. "Sarath," she said. "Queter," as if she were correcting the correction. "Sareth," he agreed. She left. The panel scraped behind her, and then the quiet of the station came back in. And Voss sat with his tray and the lamp and the particular feeling of something that had been moving in one direction for a long time, finding, slowly, that it had another axis available to it. Reth was awake in the morning. He ate half a ration pack and told Voss, in the way of someone who had been through worse and knew what worse was, that he'd had worse. Voss told him his paperwork listed him as stable, and he was free to return to his unit when he felt like carrying himself, which Reth said would be by midday, which turned out to be accurate. The station was empty by the time the second afternoon came. Voss did inventory. He cleaned things that were already clean. He read through the coalition bulletin that had come through that morning and didn't find anything he didn't already know. He ate at irregular intervals because he always ate at irregular intervals, and nobody had ever managed to change this about him. He turned the lamp up when the light went and sat with the field manual open to the section on Virith inflammatory response, and read 2 pages he'd already read, and thought about the compound he'd put on a wound 2 nights running and whether the deep tissue was going to close the way it should or was going to do something more complicated. He thought about 4 hours. He did not think about the way she'd said his rank wrong in the dark, and then said her own name like a correction. He thought about it anyway. She came back on the 3rd day, late in the day again, when the camp was doing the particular restless thing it did in the hours after a logistics run too much movement for the last hour. Then a long stillness. He heard the panel and turned, and she was there, standing in the entrance with her bearing fully in place. And there was something different in her step. "Sit down if you want to," he said. "You don't have to." She came in and sat. He set down the notes he'd been making and gave her the kind of attention he gave everyone who came through that panel, which mostly meant being still and present, not performing attentiveness, but actually having it. He'd learned a long time ago that the difference was detectable. She looked around the station, at the tray, at the lamp, at the instruments sorted by size, at a small flat object in the clean section of the tray he hadn't had there before. She looked at it for a moment. "You placed it with your instruments," she said. He followed her gaze to the calibration standard she'd brought him the previous evening. He'd been about to mention it, and then she'd left before he could properly respond to it. He'd been turning it over in his hands at intervals since, and had eventually put it where it made sense. "It's a tool," he said. "It belongs with the tools." She nodded, slowly, and something in her expression did the thing he'd been watching it do since the first night, not a smile, but the thing that existed in the architecture behind a smile, the awareness of one. There and then arranged back. "I have been thinking," she said, "about the first night, and the nights after it. I have been making a kind of inventory." She paused. Not the way she paused when she was choosing words, but the way she paused when she'd found the words and was checking them before she said them. The things that changed between arriving here and leaving, between the first time and the third. "What did you find?" he asked. "A long list." She looked at him. "The list grows each time." A pause. "You are a very specific kind of person, Cale." He registered his name in her mouth, first name, not rank, and kept his expression neutral. Because she'd said it the way she said things that mattered. Plainly, without softening or scaffolding. "What kind?" he said. "The kind," she said, carefully, like she was cutting the sentence to the right shape as she went. "Who makes it possible to be known, without making you feel that the knowing is happening to you?" He was quiet for a moment. He thought about that. "I don't know how to do anything else," he said, which was true. It had never been a method, it was just the way he was built, the way he paid attention. "I know," she said. "That is precisely what I mean." Outside, something moved through the camp supply vehicle, from the engine sound, taking the route that went around the blast zone. The lamp between them was steady. Voss looked at her, and she looked at him, and the station was very quiet. "The first night," she said then, and her voice shifted slightly, not in tone but in weight. The way a sentence carries something different when the speaker has decided to say the thing they've been carrying, rather than a version of it. "It took me longer to come here than it should have." "I know," he said. "You were 4 hours out from the end of the engagement." "Yes." A pause. "I am telling you that because I want you to understand that it was not a simple thing to do. I am not, by habit, a person who asks for help." He looked at her. He thought about the panel scraping and then stopping. The specific sound of someone who had arrived and then held. "I know," he said. "That is all you are going to say. What else should I say?" She looked at him. Something in the architecture of her expression shifted just slightly, just for a moment. Then, most people would she stopped, started again. "I have found that most people, when told a difficult thing, feel the need to respond in proportion to the difficulty. I'm not most people," he said, without any particular pride in it, because it wasn't pride. It was just a fact. "And I think you know that, or you wouldn't have come to me the first time." She held his gaze for a long moment. "Thank you," she said. The two words landed the way things she'd said across 3 evenings tended to land, fully and without extra material around them. "For what specifically?" he said. "For not doing anything else with it." She looked down at her hands, briefly. "I have given information to people in the past that they held and used, carried in the wrong direction." She looked back up. "You do not do that." "No," he agreed. He reached behind the scanner and retrieved the ration pack he'd traded a communications battery for that morning. He set it on the case beside her without comment. She looked at it, then at him. "You have been trading supplies," she said. "The standard issue bar is medically adequate. That one has actual food in it." He kept his tone practical. "You've had a significant wound for 3 days. Your recovery process has nutritional requirements, and the chalk bar doesn't meet all of them." "You knew I would come back," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, simply and without adding anything to it, "I hoped you would." She looked at him. The lamp was between them. Outside, the camp settled into the particular quiet of early evening, the kind that came before people had decided what to do with the dark. She picked up the ration pack, opened it, began eating with the same deliberate care she brought to everything. Like each action had been weighed before it began, and she was executing on the result of that weighing. "The next engagement," she said, between bites. "Coalition Command has assessed it as medium risk. My unit will be in the primary advance. I know. He'd read the operational summary that morning. I don't follow the tactical breakdown, but medically, I read whatever tells me what's coming in and in what condition. They amount to the same document, she said. Sometimes. Yes. She finished eating and set the container aside and looked at the lamp for a moment with that particular quality of looking that meant she was arranging something. Not yet sure if it was going to make it into speech. Come back after, he said. When it's done, if I am able. Come back anyway, he said. She looked at him over her shoulder on the way out, and he didn't push it further. Because he'd learned across 3 evenings that she didn't need things pushed. She processed at her own rate, and the rate was thorough. And the results of that process tended to arrive more completely than anything he might have accelerated by pressing. The panel scraped closed. He sat with the lamp and the calibration standard and the empty ration container she'd left behind, and thought about the weight of 12 words. I hoped you would. Said plainly to a person who had been deciding for 11 years what things were permitted to be hoped for. He turned the lamp down and listened to the camp go quiet and didn't try to sleep, because he knew from experience that sleep required more stillness than he currently had in him. The third check was on the 4th day, and she brought something. He didn't know what it was at first. A small flat object, dark green, set down on the case beside her when she sat without any mention of it. He inspected the wound first. The inflammation had cleared. The layers were holding. The tissue knitting in the way the compound had been designed to encourage. He told her this. She listened the way she always listened, fully, without interrupting, storing the information rather than responding to it in real time. You should be clear, he said. Get a virus surgeon to review the deep layer before the next engagement. I've done what I can with what I have, but the deep tissue wants professional work. He paused. The failure rate on unreviewed closed combat wounds is 22% in the first 6 months. I looked it up. I am aware of the statistic, she said. I looked it up as well. He looked at her. When? After the first night. He said nothing for a moment. Then he gestured at the object she'd set on the case. What is that? She picked it up and held it out to him. He took it. Thin, smooth, heavier than it looked. Some kind of composite ceramic, probably, based on the weight distribution. He turned it over in his hands. It is a calibration standard, she said, for bioadhesive application, Virith medical grade. The pressure settings and material tolerances are formulated for our cellular density. If you are treating Virith patients in the field, you should have the correct tool. He turned it over again. He'd seen these in the Coalition medical catalog. They were not cheap and not easy to source in a forward posting. Someone had gone to meaningful effort. Sareth, he said, you do not have the correct equipment, she said. It is a practical problem. The solution is practical. It is, he agreed. He set it carefully in the clean section of his tray, next to the instruments, where a tool went. Thank you. She looked at where he'd placed it, then at him. The practical framing is not. She stopped. He waited. She was doing something he'd begun to recognize over 4 days of watching her, arriving at the edge of something she hadn't said before. Running a check on whether to say it, and making the decision with the same deliberateness she brought to everything else. I know, he said quietly, before she'd finished deciding. Not to cut her off, to let her know she didn't have to finish if she didn't want to, that he'd understood. And that understanding it didn't require her to name it. She looked at him. I read the Coalition Field Manual, she said. The full document, Human Medical Practices, Allied Biology Cross-References, Field Triage Protocols for Non-Human Casualties. All of it. He kept his expression level. It's 460 pages. I am aware. When did you read it? After the first night. A pause. I began it on the morning following and finished it in the 40 hours after that. I had operational reading to complete concurrently, but I prioritized this. He thought about that about a Virath commander, 4 hours out from a serious wound, sitting with 460 pages of human medical documentation and working through it in 40 hours around everything else she had to do. He thought about why. Why, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into her jacket, the good side, her right, and set a second object on the case. A ration pack, Coalition Standard, which meant she'd had it before the engagement and had packed it in when she left for the advance. He looked at it. He looked at her. You brought that with you, he said, before the engagement. It is a ration pack, she said. I know. He picked it up, opened it, split it in half, and handed one half back without discussion. She took it. They sat with the lamp between them. And outside the camp was doing its early evening thing. And for a while neither of them said anything. 11 years, she said eventually. She was looking at the ration pack in her hand. I have been a commander for 11 years. In that time, I have not once gone to an Allied medical station outside of formal coalition medical channels. A pause. I have not asked for help outside of operational necessity. It is not a habit I have. It is closer to the absence of a habit. That's a long time to manage everything alone, he said. It is efficient, she said, and then stopped. Something in her voice changed, not the words, but the space around them. It has been efficient. He waited. I came the first night, she said, because the wound was dangerous and the coalition medical bay would have required an official report. A commander separated from her unit, injured in a way that raised questions about what had happened in the Eastern engagement. I chose not to generate those questions. I didn't file anything, he said. You noticed that? Yes, I noticed. She looked at her hands. Long-fingered, silver-white. The right knuckles still faintly marked from whatever had happened to them in the engagement. He hadn't touched those. They hadn't been why she'd come. I came the second day because the wound required it. The temperature reading was outside the acceptable range, and the correct action was to return. And today, he said. A silence longer than the ones she'd given him for medical questions. Because I wished to, she said. Which is not a reason I am accustomed to applying. He looked at her. She was looking at the lamp, not at him. And there was something in the set of her profile, in the lines that were starting to resolve into something specific as he spent more time in range of them, that he recognized. Not from her, from a much earlier version of himself. The particular quality of someone saying a true thing out loud for the first time and listening to hear what it sounds like. In the 4th year of the Corps campaign, she said, after a moment. The Virath Command suffered significant losses in the Meridian push. 42 officers. I was junior then, but I was assigned to write the formal citations. She paused. 400 documents in total. All but 42 were operational recognition standard commendation language, unit designations, action summaries. The 42 citations for the dead were different, because they were names, he said. She looked at him. Yes, in writing them. I had to recall that these were people and not operational units, and that the two things are not the same. She was quiet for a moment. You said, the first night, that you use names because it reminds you that the patient is a person. I have been thinking about that for 4 days. It's not a complicated idea, he said. No, she agreed. It is not. That is not why I have been thinking about it. A pause. Virath command structure does not encourage that kind of the separation between a soldier and a name. Between a unit and a person, it does not encourage collapsing the distinction. The distinction is considered functionally useful. I know, he said. I am aware that it is not weakness, she said carefully. I am aware of this in the way one is aware of something that one's reasoning accepts, but one's habits have not yet incorporated. There is a gap between understanding and practice. He looked at her. 11 years, 42 citations, 400 pages of a medical manual in 40 hours. 11 years is a long time to hold something like that at arm's length, he said. She met his eyes. The thing he'd been watching happen across 4 days, the slow shift. The bearing finding a new axis. Something being added to an internal structure that had run without it for a long time was happening again, quietly, in the steadiness of her expression. Yes, she said. And then, it was. He let that sit. He'd learned, by then, that she didn't need things moved along. After a while, she said, the Virath have an expression. Sarath. It refers to a person who holds the lamp when the situation deteriorates, not because they are the strongest in the room, but because they understand that the function of keeping the light steady is more important than whatever other role they might play. She paused. Historically, it was used for officers who remained constant through the worst phases of a campaign. It is a term of significant respect. I've seen it in the cultural appendix, he said, briefly. It has largely been reduced to ceremonial use in recent generations, she said. Formal dinners, installation of new command officers. The meaning has become decorative. That's unfortunate, he said. Yes. She looked at him. I am telling you this because I am not certain the word exists in a form that translates correctly, but I wanted you to understand what it means before I used it. A pause. You are. Kale. That is what you are. He was quiet for a moment. He thought about the lamp in the corner, the instruments in the tray, the calibration standard in the clean section where tools went. I'm a field medic with a lamp, he said. Yes, she said. You are. She left shortly after. And this time the exit felt different, lighter in some way he couldn't precisely name. As if she were carrying a fraction less of something than she'd come in with. He sat with that for a while. He turned the calibration standard over in his hands once. the way he'd been doing at intervals since she gave it to him, and then set it back where it belonged. He didn't sleep much that night either. The engagement briefing had come through at 1900, and he'd read it twice and done the math on what it would likely mean for the next 36 hours. The math was not encouraging. The engagement lasted 37 hours. He stopped counting at around the 22nd hour, which was unlike him. But around the 22nd hour, there was no part of his brain that could be spared for anything as clean as counting. He treated 18 casualties in the full period, 6 of them virus, 2 of them in conditions that were well past his technical authorization, but his technical authorization had been written for a forward posting that didn't exist the way this one existed, and there was nobody else. And so he did what he could do and some of what he couldn't, and kept going. He used the calibration standard on the 3rd virus soldier, a pressure seal he'd been performing approximately for 3 years, always slightly off, never disastrously wrong, but never as right as it should have been. The standard showed him what right felt like. The seal held clean. He kept working. Somewhere in the 24th hour, there was a 2-hour period when the advance stalled and the casualty flow slowed, and he sat against the wall of the station and closed his eyes and didn't quite sleep but got somewhere in the vicinity of it. He thought, not intentionally, about 8 names. He didn't know whose names. He just thought in general about names and what it cost to know them and what it cost more not to. When he opened his eyes, the push had resumed and someone was already in the doorway. He worked. He used names for all of them, even the ones who were barely conscious, even the ones he had to ask for from the soldiers who'd brought them in. It cost him something every time, and he paid it because that was the system. The ceasefire came in the middle of the afternoon. He cleaned his instruments and sat with the lamp at a low burn and waited. She came at dusk. He heard her step outside before the panel moved, and he was already turned when she came through it. She had her full bearing back the composite, measured, Saratha's commander posture, but he was 4 days into knowing her. And 4 days was enough to see the 37 hours in the way she moved. Not injured. The original wound had held. He could see by the way she carried her left side that the layers had done their job. But carrying something, the specific weight of a long command that had cost what long commands cost. There was a cut along her jaw, sealed badly with whatever had been nearest. "Sit," he said. She sat. He looked at the jaw cut first. Minor, he could handle it in minutes. He looked at her face in the lamplight and said nothing about what he saw there, because she hadn't asked him to see it, and the fact of seeing it didn't require an announcement. He cleaned the jaw cut and sealed it. He checked the original wound, holding with the virus cellular efficiency the compound had been designed to support. The layers were solid. She'd need that surgical review before the next engagement, but she was clear tonight. The primary advance, she said. Her voice was exactly what it always was, even, precise, carrying the operational vocabulary like it cost nothing. 46 virus casualties in the primary advance. "I know," he said. "I treated 6 of them." He was repacking the kit. "How many from your unit?" A silence. 8, she said. He stopped repacking. He set the kit down. He looked at her. She was looking at the far wall. Her jaw was set not the way it had been set during the wound treatment on the first night, braced against pain. Something quieter and heavier than that. The set of a person who has absorbed a number and is in the process of deciding where to put it. "I know each of their names," she said. "I knew their names before the engagement. I know each of their assignments, their unit histories, whether their families in the outer belt have been notified." A pause. The youngest was 26 in Virith years. "What is that in?" "Approximately 22. He said nothing. He let the number exist in the room for a moment before putting anything near it. "I am telling you this," she said, "because it's my command structure. There is no one to whom I tell this. The process is formal. The numbers are documented, and the citations are written, and the ceremony happens later in the appropriate context." In the informal context, she stopped. "You count them," he said. "Yes." The word came out quieter than the others. "I count them." He thought about the field hospital in the second year. The names he'd written in 40 minutes. 12 names. People he'd been near for months and had never learned until the night he had to write them down for citations, and they became the first time he'd had them. He'd carried those 12 names for 3 years. They didn't get lighter, but they got something more integrated. Maybe more part of the shape of him. "There's a difference," he said, "between something not being all right and something not being bearable. You know that." She turned and looked at him. "I know," she said, quietly. "Yes." They sat with the 8 names between them, unnamed aloud, but present. The lamp was steady. Outside, somewhere across the camp, a radio cycled through a frequency check and went still. The evening was full dark now, coming in through the gaps in the relay tower walls. "The Virith have a phrase," she said, after a while. "Vel Theod. It translates roughly as the weight that becomes part of you, not a burden to be set down. A thing that changes the shape you carry." He held that. He turned it over the way he'd been turning over other things she'd given him. "I know that feeling," he said. "I didn't have a word for it." "I believe you do," she said. And then, after a pause, "When did you first understand it? That it was part of you and not just something you were carrying?" He thought about it honestly. She asked questions in order to know the answer, not to participate in the exchange. And that distinction mattered enough that he tried to match it. "Second year of the campaign," he said. "There was a coalition hospital hit in the night. By the time I got there, most of the work was already done. I was just writing names for the citations. I wrote 12 names in 40 minutes. He looked at the lamp. People I'd been near for months. I found out their names that night, for the first time, because I needed them for the paperwork." "Theater," she said. "Guess that." She looked at him in the lamplight. Her face was very still. "When I write the 8 citations," she said, slowly, "I will know their names. I knew them before the engagement. I know the youngest was 22. A pause. "I am telling you this because there is no one in my command structure to whom I tell this. And I find," she stopped, "I find that the weight is lighter when it is said. It doesn't go away," he said. "No, but it's lighter when it's said." "Yes," she nodded. One deliberate nod, the considered kind. They sat with the 8 names and the lamp and the dark outside the station walls until the quality of the quiet shifted toward the late hour, and she looked up. And he said, "Sereth." "Yes, the 22% failure rate. You know it." A pause. "I know it." "Before the next engagement," he said, "find the Virith surgeon." She looked at him for a long moment. Then something moved at the corner of her mouth, the thing that knew what a smile was. "Not I'll consider it," he said. "No," she agreed. And there was something in her voice that he hadn't heard there before, something that knew it was almost warm and was not entirely disowning the fact. "Not I'll consider it." She stood. The movement was her own movement, full weight, full balance. The 37 hours present in it but not diminishing it. At the door she paused, not looking back. "Vel Theod, Kale," she said. The words landed with the weight she'd given them. "Vel Theod," he said. She went out. He sat with the lamp and the calibration standard in his clean tray and the particular feeling of 8 names he didn't know the shape of yet, and the way a word can carry something all the way from one language into another if the person saying it means it correctly. He turned the lamp down and did not try to sleep for a long time. The days after a long engagement had a specific texture. Not quiet exactly, there was always noise in a forward camp. Logistics runs and equipment checks and the particular percussion of a coalition that had just survived something and was assessing what that had cost, but quieter than before. The kind of quiet that came from everyone doing only the necessary things, and doing them without much conversation. Voss did the necessary things. He filed his casualty reports. He restocked the kit from the supply cache and noted what the cache was missing and put in a requisition that would probably come back partial. The way requisitions in forward postings always came back partial. He read the medical bulletins that came through and noted anything relevant. He treated a sprained shoulder and a chemical burn and a case of something gastrointestinal that he declined to investigate too closely. He ate at irregular intervals. He slept in the way he slept after long engagements, which was heavily and without dreaming and in blocks that didn't correspond to any sensible schedule. He thought about Vel Theod. About 8 names he didn't know and the shape they had in the room when she'd said the number. About 22 in Virath years, which was approximately something else in the years that actually meant anything to him. He thought about a person who had read 460 pages in 40 hours because she wanted to understand. He turned the calibration standard over in his hands when his hands weren't doing anything else, which was more often than he could account for. On the second day after the ceasefire, he cleaned the station more thoroughly than it needed and reorganized the supply cases in an order that was marginally more logical than the previous order and admitted to himself, without making a larger thing of it than it was, that he was filling time in a way that was specific rather than general. On the evening of the second day, he heard the panel. He was seated at the case, writing up the last of the casualty documentation that needed to go to the coalition medical office by morning. He put the stylus down and turned. She came through without the careful management of the first night or the measured assessment of the nights after it. She came through the way she moved when she wasn't managing anything except herself, full bearing, full weight. 4 days of watching her stride. And he knew the difference by now between the version of it that was performing something and the version that wasn't. There was no visible wound. She wasn't holding her arm wrong. She wasn't moving with the controlled compression of someone keeping pain out of her gait. "Sit down if you want to," he said. "You don't have to." She came in and sat. He set the documentation aside and gave her his full attention, the kind that was just stillness and presence, not leaning forward, not marking the significance of the moment. Just being in the room with her the way he was in the room with anyone who came through that panel. He'd found, over years of this work, that the quality of attention people felt most was the kind that didn't announce itself. She looked around the station, at the tray, at the sorted instruments, at the lamp, at the calibration standard in the clean section beside his other tools, where he'd placed it on the third day. "You kept it there," she said. "It belongs there." Something in her expression did the thing he'd been watching it do across 5 evenings. The small shift in the architecture of it, not a smile, the thing behind a smile. The awareness of warmth without quite letting it surface, there and then arranged back. "I have been thinking," she said, "about the first night, and the ones after it. I have been constructing it as a kind of inventory. The things that changed between arriving at your station and leaving. Each time," she paused. "The list is significant." "What did you find?" he said. "Many things." She looked at him with a directness that was different from the evaluating look of the first night. She wasn't cataloging anymore. She was looking at something she'd already cataloged, that she now knew the shape of, and was deciding what to do with that knowledge. "You are a very specific kind of person." "Cale," he waited. "The kind," she said, carefully, working the words out as she went, "who makes it possible to be known without making you feel that the knowing is happening to you." She paused. "Most people, when they pay attention to you, make you aware of the attention. It has a quality of being received, observed, filed." She stopped. "You do not do that. The attention is simply present, and you can speak into it without the sense that what you say is being collected." He thought about this. "I don't know how to do it differently," he said. "It's not a technique." "I know," she said. "That is precisely what I mean." Outside, the camp was doing its evening logistics wind down. Distant sounds of equipment being moved. Voices somewhere north of the relay tower. The low frequency of a vehicle taking the perimeter road. Inside the station, the lamp was steady between them, and the calibration standard was in the clean section of his tray, and the documentation he hadn't finished yet was face down on the case. She reached into her jacket, her right side the good one. She produced a folded piece of paper, which was unusual. Most coalition communication moved through digital channels at this posting. She looked at it for a moment, then set it on the case between them. "The coalition has posted the senior medical coordinator position at Velhari Station," she said. "The formal listing appeared in the bulletin yesterday morning." He looked at the paper. He hadn't checked the bulletin yesterday. He'd been finishing the casualty reports. "I saw it," she said, "and I read the listing in full." She paused. "The position is a minimum 3-month posting. The station is a permanent installation with full coalition resources, not a forward camp. Medical grade 4 and above qualifies automatically." He kept his expression even. "I'm grade 3. The posting allows for field-qualified grade 3 personnel with documented experience in allied biology." She said it the way she said information she'd spent time with. The language in the listing is specific. It was added in this posting's bulletin, not in the previous quarters. Someone amended the qualification criteria. He looked at the paper. He didn't pick it up yet. "The current senior coordinator at Velhari is a human specialist only," she continued. "There is a documented gap in allied biology coverage. It is listed in the Coalition Resource Assessment from the 3rd quarter. You read the resource assessment," he said. "I have been thorough," she said, without any particular emphasis on the word. "Just a fact." He picked up the paper and read the listing. The language was specific, the way she'd said. "Field qualified grade 3 with documented allied biology experience." He had documented allied biology experience. He had, at this point, documented allied biology experience that exceeded most grade 4s in this posting. Because he'd been doing the work for 3 years without the proper equipment and then doing it for 3 days with the proper equipment, and the difference had been instructive. He set the paper back down. "The posting is 6 months minimum for your rank," he said, "possibly longer, possibly extending to a year." she said. If the negotiation period requires additional medical support. Yes. He was quiet. He looked at the lamp. He thought about the administrative transfer that had come across his desk in the second year of the Kolith campaign, attached to the commendation, and that he had declined without much deliberation because the position would have moved him to a coordination role, and he did not want a coordination role. He thought about why he hadn't wanted it. The work was here, he'd thought. The work was in the room with the person, not in the documentation about the person. And moving to the documentation had seemed like a direction he didn't recognize as his own. Velhari wasn't documentation. My unit transfers in 12 days, Sarath said. He looked at her. She was looking at the lamp. The particular quality of looking at it that he'd learned by now meant she wasn't looking at the lamp. She was looking at something she was in the middle of deciding, or had already decided, and was letting him see that she was looking at it. The posting is 6 months for my rank, she said, possibly extending. As you noted. He said nothing. I am telling you this, she said, because I would like you to know it. Not because I am asking you to do anything with the information. I want to be clear about the distinction. I understand the distinction, he said. She turned and looked at him. The lamp was between them, the evening fully dark beyond the relay tower walls, and the station was the station instruments in the tray. Supply cases stacked north. Calibrations standard in the clean section. Paper on the case between them. All the same as it had been. Something in it different. If the transfer committee asked you, he said slowly, why you were requesting a specific field medic for the Velhari posting, what would you tell them? She was quiet for a long moment. I would tell them, she said, that this particular field medic uses names, that he does not adjust his standard of care based on rank or species, that he reads the Coalition Field Manual on Allied Biology because he prefers to be prepared rather than adequate. A pause. That he keeps better rations for patients who have had difficult 36 hours, that he says thank you when it is not required, that he does not say it will be all right. He looked at her. I would also note, she said, that the medical bay at Velhari Station has a documented gap in allied biology training that a field-qualified Grade 3 with relevant experience is positioned to address, and that the language in the current listing was amended specifically to allow for this qualification pathway. Another pause. And that the Coalition Resource Assessment from the third quarter identifies this gap as high priority. That would be a compelling argument, he said. I thought so, she said. He looked at the bulletin listing on the case between them. He thought about the Kolith campaign and the transfer he'd declined and all the reasons he'd declined it. He thought about a field station with a proper medical bay and a permanent installation and full Coalition resources. He thought about a person who had read 460 pages in 40 hours and carried 42 names in the fourth year of a campaign and had stood outside a panel for some amount of time deciding whether to come through it, and had come through anyway. He thought about 12 days. The transfer request form, he said. I'd need to submit it to Coalition Medical by the end of the week to make the processing window. She nodded. Once the small precise nod, the considered kind. I'll put in for it, he said. Something happened in her expression. He caught it because he'd been paying the kind of attention he'd been paying. He wouldn't have caught it otherwise. It lasted for exactly the right amount of time to almost not exist. Something that was not quite the thing behind his smile but was in the same family as it. Something that released very briefly in the lines of her face and was then composed back into its place. Good, she said. He reached over and adjusted the lamp. It had been at the angle that was best for close work, the angle he set it at, when there was a patient in the station and he needed to see clearly. He moved it slightly toward the angle that was better for two people sitting without any particular task between them. She looked at the lamp. She looked at him. There is something else, she said. He waited. The fourth year of the core campaign, she said. I told you about the citations, the 42 names. She paused. I have not told that to anyone outside the formal reporting structure. Not the number, not what it was like to write them. Not the fact that I remember them. Another pause. In 11 years of command, I have not told it. He held that carefully. Why tell me? She thought about the question the way she thought about real questions, not quickly, not as a formality. Because you would not do anything wrong with it, she said. You would not manage it or arrange it or try to resolve it. You would simply know it. She looked at him. I have found that very few people can hold information that way, without trying to fix the shape of it. Some things don't have a shape to fix. He said. Yes, she said. I know that. I have known it for 11 years. I did not know that someone else could know it too, in a way that felt like the same knowing. She paused. That is what has been most surprising. He thought about the specific quality of being surprised by something you'd believed wasn't available. The recalibration that required. 11 years was a long time to run a system and then find the system had been working around a gap it hadn't named. The 8 names, he said, from the advance. She looked at him. Vel Theard, he said. She was quiet for a long moment. Yes, she said finally. All 8 of them. The lamp burned between them. The documentation was still face down on the case. The calibration standard was where tools went. Outside, someone's equipment made a sound on the far side of the camp and then was quiet. And the evening settled into the particular late stillness of a coalition camp that had come through something and was still deciding what it meant. He thought about 12 days. He thought about the form he'd need to complete, the filing window, the language in the listing that left room for a grade 3 with relevant experience. He thought about the difference between a forwarding posting and a permanent installation and whether the work he did in each of them was the same work or different work. And he arrived at the conclusion he'd arrived at before. The work was in the room with the person. The station was incidental. I requisitioned the transfer form 2 days ago, he said. She looked at him. I told myself I was being premature, he said. Irresponsible. Probably. I didn't fill it out. But you requisitioned it, she said. Yes. She held his gaze for a moment. Then, when will you file it? End of the week, he said, to make the processing window. She nodded. The small nod again. The one that acknowledged something without making more of it than it needed to be. He was starting to understand that nod as a kind of precision instrument, the way she confirmed things she'd anticipated, while still allowing herself to feel the confirmation. Sarath, he said. Yes, the resource assessment you read. He picked up the listing and held it for a moment. 3rd quarter. That's 140 pages. Approximately, she said. You read it. I told you, she said. I have been thorough. He set the listing back on the case. He looked at her, and she looked at him. And the lamp was between them, and the evening was full dark outside the relay tower walls. And the station was the station small and functional, and smelling like antiseptic and old dust, and the particular quiet that followed something. Good night, Sarath, he said. Good night, Kale, she said. She stood, and the movement was clean and fully her own. And she went out through the panel, and he heard her step on the ground outside. Steady and even. And then the sounds of the camp came back in through the gaps in the walls and he was alone in the lamplight. He sat for a while. Then he pulled the transfer request form from under the documentation stack he had. In fact, requisitioned it 2 days ago, which was the kind of thing he did when he was being precise about his own irresponsibility, and looked at the blank fields. Name, designation, requested posting, reason for transfer. He left the reason field for the morning and set the form on the case where he'd see it first thing and turned the lamp down to a low burn and ate the cracker he'd had in his pocket since afternoon. He thought about 12 days. He thought about 460 pages. He thought about a person who had stood outside a bent panel in the middle of the night and held there for some amount of time and then come through anyway, and how the specific weight of that decision had been present in everything that followed. The way certain things are present in everything that follows once you know to look for them. He closed his eyes. For the first time in 5 nights. He slept. He filed the form in the morning. He'd woken earlier than he intended, before the camp had fully started its day. And he lay on the cot for a while with the relay tower making its particular sounds above him and thought about the reason field. Coalition medical need was accurate. He'd checked the resource assessment she'd mentioned. Found it easily because she'd given him the specific quarter and the specific gap. And the gap was documented clearly enough that no transfer committee was going to question a grade 3 with his experience applying to address it. It was accurate. It was also, he thought, in the way that certain accurate things were. Not quite the whole story. He got up and filled in the form. Name, designation, current posting, requested posting, and the reason in 3 words in the last field. Coalition medical need. He set it aside to submit through the Coalition medical channel and made himself eat something and did the morning checks on the supply cases and read the daily bulletin and found nothing in it that required his attention. He submitted the form at 900. The day passed the way days passed in the stretch between engagements. He treated a Vireth corporal with a stress fracture who hadn't mentioned it until it became impossible to walk on, which was a pattern he'd encountered before in both species. He did the documentation he'd been behind on. He recatalogued the kit in the order he'd taught himself to keep it during the Kolith campaign, which was not the officially recommended order but was the order that put the things he reached for first closest to his hands. He turned the calibration standard over in his hands at intervals. The evening came in, and the camp shifted into its after-hours register, and he turned the lamp up and sat with the things he had left to do, which were not many. She came when the light outside had gone fully dark. Not the careful panel scrape of the first night, not the managed step of the second, the particular sound of her. Nothing, and then, right at the last second, the unavoidable contact of the panel with the floor, and then she was through it. No wound, no held arm, no compressed posture. She came through the panel and stood in the entrance the way she stood when she was managing nothing but herself, and looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "Sit down," he said. She came in and sat. The case, the same one. She set her hands on her knees and looked at the lamp and the tray and the calibration standard in the clean section, and then looked at him. "I submitted the form this morning," he said. "Coalition medical need. It's in the processing queue." She nodded. The small nod. 12 days, he said. 11. Now, she said. He held that. He didn't add anything to it because it didn't need anything added. The station was quiet around them. He'd treated no one since the corporal with the stress fracture. The lamp was at the angle he'd moved it to the previous evening, the angle for two people rather than the angle for close work, and the light fell between them in the way it fell when there was no particular task to illuminate. After a while he said, "The first night." She looked at him. "You stood outside," he said. "Before you came through, I heard the panel move and then stop. There was a moment. A pause." She looked at the lamp again. "Yes, what happened in that moment?" A longer silence. He waited in it the way he'd learned to wait, with her not filling it, not signaling toward it, just present in it until she was ready to move through it. "I told myself," she said slowly, "that I was coming here for medical reasons, that the wound was the reason, that it was a practical decision, and that the practical decision was the thing I was making." A pause. "I stood there and I told myself this clearly, in some detail. And then you came in anyway," he said. "Yes." He looked at the lamp. He thought about the panel moving and then stopping and then moving again, wider, and the specific weight of the moment between. "I understood it from the second evening," he said. She looked at him. "When you came back on the second day instead of the third," he said, "the wound gave you reason to come back. But the second day was earlier than the wound required. So I understood that you'd come back when you could without it being the night you'd just left." Something moved in her expression. Something precise and specific. The way certain things were precise and specific when they were real. "The temperature reading," she said. "The Virith field reference for wound temperature variance. The numbers were concerning." "I know," he said. "That's true. It is true," she said. "And," she stopped, looked at the lamp. "And because it was the earliest I could come without it being the same night." He said nothing. He let the sentence exist in the room the way sentences needed to exist when they'd cost something to say. 11 years, she said, after a moment. Not to him. Quite. More to the lamp, or to the space between them, or to something she'd been carrying for 11 years that she was now putting somewhere slightly more external. "For 11 years I have decided what things were permitted to be. I have found the frame that made a decision allowable, and I have operated within that frame, and I have not allowed the thing to be other than what the frame permitted. The wound being the reason," he said. "The wound being the reason," she said. "The temperature variance being the reason. The resource gap being the reason." A pause. "The reasons have been accurate. Every one of them. I did not manufacture them. I know, but they have not been the whole of it." She looked at him. Her eyes in the lamplight were pale silver, the same as they'd always been, and they were not cold. He'd known for days now that they were not cold. He'd known since the second night that the way the lamplight caught them was not temperature, but something specific to their structure. The way Virith eyes were built to take in light differently, and he'd stopped misreading it sometime around the 4th day. "I have not been in the habit of allowing things to be the whole of what they are. I have not allowed it for a long time." "What changed?" he said. She was quiet for a long time. "The first night," she said. "Before I came here. There is a Coalition medical bay 200 meters east of this station. It is staffed through the night. It is the correct protocol destination for a commander with a field wound." A pause. "I stood at the entrance for approximately 6 minutes. He looked at her and didn't go in." "No." She looked at her hands. Long-fingered, silver white. The right knuckles still faintly marked from the engagement. He knew those hands by now. He'd never touched them. But he knew them the way you knew something you'd spent time near. "I told myself it was the report, the official record." The questions that would follow from a commander presenting to the medical bay with a wound sustained in circumstances that weren't clearly documented. A pause. That was also true. And, he said. She looked up at him. Direct, the kind of looking she did when she'd decided. I had heard about the human at the field station, she said, from soldiers who had come through here. The particular way the care was described. A pause. The words varied, but the substance was consistent. I had been aware of it for several weeks before the Eastern engagement. He held this carefully. He was aware of his hands, which were still in his lap. He was aware of the lamp, which was steady. He was aware that she was telling him something that had no frame around it, no practical rationale she'd pre-approved, and that this was the most difficult kind of thing for her to tell. I wanted, she said, and stopped. He waited. I had not allowed myself to want things that did not serve a clear operational purpose for 11 years. She said. The wanting felt like a kind of risk I could not justify. I stood at the Coalition Medical Bay entrance for 6 minutes and I ran the risk calculation and I could not justify it and I came here instead. That's not quite the same as not being able to justify it, he said, gently. Something shifted in her face, a very slight motion, like a door that had been precisely balanced finding a new position. No, she said, it is not. You came anyway, he said. I came anyway. He looked at her. He thought about a person who had been running a system for 11 years in which things were permitted to be what they were allowed to be and nothing beyond it, and who had stood outside a bent panel in the dark and run the calculation and gotten an answer she'd decided not to follow, and had come through anyway. Sarath, he said. She looked at him. I'm glad you did, he said. The first night and all the ones after it. A very long quiet. The kind of quiet that had its own texture, not empty, not waiting. Just the specific quality of air in a room where something true has been said and both people in the room are letting it be true without moving to do anything about it yet, she said. The first night. When you said you use names because it helps you remember the patient is his person. A pause. I had been thinking, even before I came through the panel, about the kind of person who would say that. Not as a method, not as a technique, just as a thing that was true about how they moved through the world. It's not something I decided, he said. I know, she said. That is what I had been thinking about. He held her gaze. He thought about the 460 pages, about the calibration standard in the clean section of his tray, about better rations packed before an advance that had nothing to do with medical recovery and everything to do with something she hadn't named until just now. The hoping, he said. When you wrote the listing language into your notes, you said you were aware that you were hoping. She looked at him steadily. Yes, what were you hoping for? She was quiet for a long moment, the lamp between them, the camp doing its late evening sounds outside the relay tower walls. That it would not be what I had decided to permit, she said, that it would be more than that. A pause. I have not hoped for things often. I find that hoping requires handing the weight of the hope to someone else, trusting them with it. I am not in the habit of that. I know, he said quietly. I noticed it. From the first night. What did you notice? That you'd been carrying things alone for a long time, he said, and that it was heavy. Not in any way you were showing. In the way the not showing costs something. He paused. The 4 hours between the end of the Eastern engagement and coming here. That's not a reaction time. That's a person talking themselves into something. She looked at him. Something in her expression was doing the thing it had been doing across all 5 evenings. The slow shift. The internal structure-making room. And this time it made room for something larger and didn't immediately arrange itself back. It stayed. I stood outside for a moment, she said, and then I came in. Yes, he said. And the first thing you did, she said, was spread the sterile cloth and set the instruments in order. You did not look up. You did not manage the situation. You did not perform competence for the benefit of a Virith commander who had arrived without protocol in the middle of the night. She paused. You simply made room. He said nothing. She didn't need him to say anything. She was telling him something she had been working out for several days and was now delivering in its finished form. And what it needed from him was to be received, which was different from being responded to. I have been trying, she said, to find the correct language for what that was. I do not have a satisfactory equivalent in Virith. The nearest word we have is for someone who leaves a lamp burning in a window, not because they are waiting for a specific person, because that is the kind of person they are. She looked at him. I have been thinking about that word for 5 evenings. It's a good word, he said. Yes, she said. It is, outside, somewhere in the camp. Someone's equipment ran a diagnostic cycle and went quiet. The relay tower made the sound it made at this hour. A low structural settling. The lamp between them held its angle. She said his name. Cale, yes. Thank you, she said. She said it the way she said things that mattered plainly, without scaffolding. Without the social architecture she'd defined for him on the second night as the thing she didn't want around information. Just the words and what they carried. He looked at her. He thought about all the things he could say and found the one that was accurate. It's what I'm here for, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. No, she said, quietly. It is not. A pause. It is what you chose. There is a difference. And I have been thinking about that difference for 5 days. He was still. She was right. He knew she was right the way he knew things that arrived in the room already true. It was what he'd chosen, the staying at this posting instead of the administrative role. The reading of the field manual twice in the first month. The requisitioning of the Virith-compatible compound on the basis of an instinct about what he might need. The name of every patient, including the ones who wouldn't remember he'd used it. All of it a choice. Every day. And he hadn't thought of it as a choice because it hadn't felt like one. It had felt like being the kind of person he was. But she was pointing out, precisely and correctly, that those two things were not mutually exclusive. You're right, he said. I know, she said, and there was something in it very quiet, very small. In exactly the register, she held things that had warmth in them that was not quite a smile and was not trying to be and was better for it. She stood. The movement was clean and even, fully her own weight. No management of anything. She straightened and her bearing settled back into its natural position, the way something returned to its correct orientation after being, briefly, deliberately set aside. At the panel she paused. She didn't turn around. She just stood for a moment in the entrance with the camp's night sounds coming in around her, and he watched her, and neither of them said anything. Then she went out. He heard her step on the ground outside steady, even, the full weight of her own self in it. Not lighter exactly, but different in some way he thought might take a while to name. The sounds of the camp came back in through the relay tower walls and settled around him, and the lamp and the instrument tray and the calibration standard in the clean section where tools went. He sat for a while. He thought about 11 days. He thought about Vel Theat, about the weight that becomes part of you and changes the shape you carry. He thought about a person who had read 460 pages to understand him and had stood at the entrance of the Coalition Medical Bay for 6 minutes and then come here instead, and all the deciding that had preceded the single step through the panel. He thought about what it meant to choose something rather than simply to be the kind of person who did it. How the difference was real even when the outcome was the same. How naming the difference was the thing she'd been doing across 5 evenings with the particular precision she brought to everything. Carving out the exact shape of something so it could exist correctly rather than approximately. After a while, he picked up the transfer form. He'd submitted it that morning with the reason field filled in Coalition Medical Need. 3 words. Accurate, documented, unchallengeable. He looked at the copy he'd kept. He read the 3 words. He thought about all the other words that were also true, that did not fit in the reason field, that would not have survived the transfer committee's review process even if he'd tried to put them there. The resource gap was real. The documentation was accurate. The language in the bulletin listing had been amended to allow for exactly his qualifications. And whoever had amended it had been thorough enough to cross-reference the Coalition Resource Assessment from the 3rd quarter. And he knew who had been thorough. He set the copy of the form down and put it with his documentation and turned the lamp to its lowest setting and sat in the quiet for a moment with all of it the calibration standard. The 11 days. The weight that became part of you, the difference between what you were and what you chose. Then he closed his eyes. He slept, fully, without counting, without the edges of the day coming back in to find him. The kind of sleep that came when something that had been unresolved found its resolution and stopped taking up the space that sleep needed. Outside, the camp did its night sounds. The relay tower settled. The lamp burned low and steady. In the morning, there would be 11 days and a processing queue and all the practical arithmetic of a transfer between postings. And there would be work to do, because there was always work to do, and he would do it. He would do it with his hands and the calibration standard and the field manual and the names of whoever came through his panel. And that was not nothing. It was, in fact, exactly what it had always been. A choice, made the same way. Every day, he slept.